The Lost Colony of Roanoke, Theories and Evidence. In 1587, 115 English settlers arrived on Roanoke Island, present-day North Carolina. Their governor, artist John White, left for supplies in England. When he returned 3 years later, nothing of the colony remained. No people, no sign of struggle. The only clue was the word CROATOAN carved into a fence post, and the partial carving crow on a nearby tree. White had instructed the colonists to carve the name of their destination if they left, and to add a cross if they were in distress. He found no cross and noted CROATOAN in plain letters, which he interpreted as an indication they had moved to CROATOAN Island, Hatteras. Apart from these carved letters, White reported that the settlement's buildings had been dismantled but not destroyed, and no bodies or graves were found. These facts are undisputed. Everything else about the fate of the colonists remains a matter of interpretation and debate.
Historical context and facts. Before examining theories, we establish the known facts from historical sources. 1584 to 85 contact. Early voyages, Barlow 1584, Grenville/Lane 1585, established contact with local Algonquian tribes, Secotans and Croatoans. In 1585, a friendly Croatoan leader, Menteo, and another, Wanshis, were taken to England as informants. They returned in 1586. Only Menteo remained friendly. Governor Lane's men eventually burned a native village, Aquascogok, in retaliation for a theft, souring relations. Early reports note conflict risk in famine, though Lane's colony was evacuated in 1586 by Sir Francis Drake.
1587 colony. In July 1587, John White led a new group, including women and children, back to Roanoke Island. It included his daughter, Eleanor, and granddaughter, Virginia Dare. White's original intention was to move north to the Chesapeake Bay, per instructions from Sir Walter Raleigh, but bad weather and a piratical pilot, Simon Fernandez, forced them to stay on Roanoke Island. Shortly after landing, the colony suffered a murder of George Howe by native warriors, and tensions rose. White agreed to return to England for supplies. He left instructions for the colonists to carve any departure plans on a post and to carve a cross if they were under distress. He also left behind pinnaces, small boats that could be used if relocation became necessary. 1590 discovery. John White finally returned in August 1590. He found no settlers and no cross on the carved Croatoan message. He wrote that he greatly joyed that I had safely found a certain token of their safe being at CROATOAN, which is the place where Menteo was born, and the savages of the island are friends. White's primary report is preserved in Hakluyt's Principal Navigations. The colonists' homes and palisade were gone, but rather than burned or blown down, defenses and huts had been taken apart. White saw no signs of fire or battle. He visited nearby CROATOAN Island, Hatteras, to look, but a storm and crude descent forced him to abort the search. He left empty-handed in 1590. Importantly, White himself noted only that CROATOAN was carved with no cross, not that the colonists had disappeared or died. He sent no report of bodies or struggle, only of this cryptic message. These are the documented facts: a carved message, no survivors found, and no obvious evidence of violence or disaster on Roanoke Island. Historians and archaeologists must build theories around these clues. The following sections review each major theory, what evidence supports or contradicts it, and relevant scholarly analyses.
Assimilation with native peoples. CROATOAN hypothesis. A leading theory is that the colonists relocated to CROATOAN, Hatteras Island, and integrated with the friendly Croatoan Indians. This idea is often called the CROATOAN or Hatteras assimilation hypothesis. Key points include: carved clue, CROATOAN Island. John White explicitly noted CROATOAN carved on the palisade post. He believed it indicated where the colonists had gone. CROATOAN, Hatteras Island, was home to the friendly CROATOAN tribe and was also the birthplace of the colonial ally Manteo. White wrote that finding CROATOAN with no cross meant the colonists were there and safe. In a 1591 map by Theodore de Bray, CROATOAN and nearby Hatteras, Ocracoke, are marked just 20 to 30 miles south of Roanoke.
Archaeological finds. Recent digs on Hatteras Island have uncovered artifacts dating to the late 1500s, some of which strongly suggest an English presence. In particular, archaeologist Mark Horton, University of Bristol, reports that a 2019 excavation on the CROATOAN village site, Buxton area, yielded remarkable finds. Among these were the iron hilt of an Elizabethan-style rapier sword and 2 pieces of a writing slate with a faint drawing of a man firing a musket. Such objects are not native to the region. A medieval-style rapier, for example, would have belonged to a European, and Horton noted the early colonists would not part with their swords. The slate, with pencil sketch, likewise had no obvious native use. Even more telling was the discovery of a glass arrowhead made by a CROATOAN craftsman. Glass did not exist in native technology. Its presence implies trade with or inheritance from the English. In Horton's words, finding English goods in the CROATOAN villages is more evidence that the colony may have assimilated there.
Historical accounts. 17th and 18th century writers recorded memories of Hatteras inhabitants claiming European ancestors. For example, explorer John Lawson wrote in 1709 that CROATOAN villagers told him several of their ancestors were white people and could talk in a book as we do. In 1710, missionary John Ermstone noted residents of Hatteras were half Indian and half English when they came for baptism. These statements suggest at least some intermarriage. To be fair, Lawson and Ermstone were outsiders looking back over a century, and accounts may mix oral history with colonial narratives. Archaeological corroboration and debate. Modern investigations back up the assimilation scenario. Kathleen Duvall, a UNC historian, noted that iron flakes, hammer scale, found at Hatteras are consistent with colonists forging new nails and tools there. On-site museum director Scott Dawson has unearthed other Elizabethan artifacts, a writing tablet, gun parts, rapier hilt, pieces of clothing, etc., which he interprets as colonial. The First Colony Foundation also highlights European items at sites in the Outer Banks. In 2021, a study by climate scientists found that 1587 through 1589 were the driest years in 8 centuries in Virginia, suggesting colonists may have desperately needed to relocate and source food, possibly by joining the CROATOANs.
However, skeptics caution that none of this is conclusive. The U.S. Park Service notes that no village site or graves definitively linked to the 1587 colonists have been found on Hatteras. Many of the European artifacts, glass, ceramics, metal, could have been traded or accumulated over decades rather than left by the Lost Colony specifically. Indeed, the CROATOANs did trade with later English visitors, which could explain some finds. Archaeologist Elaine Outlaw, Christopher Newport University, calls Dawson's claims storytelling, not evidence-based, noting that I have not seen any evidence at CROATOAN of artifacts that indicate Englishmen were living there. Even Dawson's own book admits there is no smoking gun proof. Similarly, Horton's finds, rapier, slate, arrowhead, show European contact, but whether those came from the 1587 colonists or other castaways or pirates is debated. On balance, however, many historians now regard the CROATOAN assimilation as plausible. As one commentator observed, the CROATOAN hypothesis backs up the most likely theory given the evidence.
Key points: CROATOAN theory. White's carved clue, CROATOAN, no cross, suggests relocation to Hatteras Island. Archaeologists have uncovered 16th century English artifacts at Hatteras, a rapier hilt and musket-engraved writing slate, a glass arrowhead, trade beads, pottery, etc. Later travelers, 1700s, recorded Hatteras natives claiming several of their ancestors were white people and half Indian and half English lineage. Caveats: no definitive colonial village or human remains found on Hatteras. Some European items may stem from later contact or other castaways. Critics say evidence is suggestive but not conclusive.
Hostile attack by native tribes. Another theory is that the colonists were killed in a conflict with local Native Americans. Several clues and accounts fuel this idea. Early conflicts. The 1585 settlement had already seen violence. Governor Lane's men killed Wingina, a CROATOAN chief, and later retaliated against CROATOANs by burning villages. CROATOANs had been friendly, but the CROATOANs became openly hostile. In 1587, after the murder of George Howe, colonists briefly feared war with the mainland Algonquian tribe, Wingina's kin. White found on his return that some hidden stores had been looted. He blamed a group he called the Savages Our Enemies at Dassamungapuk for digging up the buried chests. This indicates at least one hostile raid on the deserted site, though possibly after the colonists left.
Jamestown reports. When Jamestown was founded in 1607, its leaders heard stories about Roanoke survivors. The Powhatan chief Wawansanakok Algonquin and his lieutenants claimed to have destroyed the colony. William Strachey, secretary of Jamestown, recorded an Algonquin named Matchumps who told him the lost colonists had lived peacefully with Native Americans until they were attacked by Wawansanakok's warriors around the time settlers arrived at Jamestown in 1607. Only a few colonists had survived the attack. Captain John Smith likewise heard of tribes wearing English-style clothing and building English-like houses inland. These reports suggest that if any colonists survived off Roanoke, they were eventually caught up in the Powhatan-Opechancanough offensives of 1607. Historian James Horn, 2010, argues that the Powhatan leader decided to eliminate any remnant English, ordering his warriors to track down as many of White's colonists and kill them. In this view, many survivors might have been with inland tribes, Tuscaroras, Chewanoks, etc., and Powhatan feared a renewed English incursion, prompting a massacre.
Evidence against massacre on Roanoke Island. Archaeology on Roanoke Island has found no mass grave, no charred remains, and no indication of a battle. White noted that the palisade was intact, and that buildings were removed neatly, not burned or scattered. The National Park Service reports, when White returned in 1590, he did not notice any signs of a Spanish attack at the village location, implying similarly no sign of a large native assault. In short, if the entire colony was killed on Roanoke Island, we would expect burned-out cabins or bodies, but none were recorded. Some historians think a small conflict could have occurred, but the absence of evidence on Roanoke Island itself weakens the idea of a complete massacre there.
Mixed evidence. It's possible that some colonists died violently and others escaped. Horn's theory is that survivors fled inland and later fell in Opechancanoug's raids. Alternatively, Lee Miller, 2001, suggested colonial officials obscured a massacre. However, this war theory has no smoking gun. No definitive Powhatan massacre site has been found, and native oral histories are ambiguous. The only certain point is that friendly CROATOANs were not reported to have turned on the English, and any war likely involved other tribes, Secotans, Tuscaroras, etc.
Key points: hostile attack. Early Algonquin tension, the Secotàn War, murder of Howe, raised conflict risk. John White blamed Algonquin enemies at Dassamungapuk for looting supplies. Jamestown-era rumors, Powhatan accounts via Strachey and Smith, claimed colonists were attacked inland, leaving few survivors. James Horn argued Powhatan deliberately hunted down Roanoke survivors. Caveats: no physical evidence of a large-scale killing on Roanoke Island itself. The colony's dismantled structures contradict a fiery raid. These tales could be mistaken, conflated, or propaganda.
A Spanish involvement. Some early theories involve the Anglo-Spanish War, 1585 to 1604. Since England and Spain were at war, and Spanish ships passed through the area, could the Spanish have captured or destroyed the colony? Spanish reconnaissance. In 1587, Spanish privateers captured an English sailor, Francis Nelson, who revealed details of the Roanoke colony. Alarmed, Spain sent Captain Vicente Gonzalez in 1588 to search for the English settlement. Gonzalez scoured the Outer Banks in Chesapeake but found only an unfinished boat slip on Roanoke Island. No colonists, no fort, just a dugout channel. When White arrived in 1590, he likewise saw no evidence of any Spanish attack on the village site. No cannon damage, no Spanish trophies, no murdered bodies reported.
Evidence for against. On one hand, Spain was actively hostile and a Spanish raid could have removed the colony. On the other hand, the lack of any damage to the Roanoke site argues against a violent Spanish assault. The Park Service concludes, White did not notice any signs of a Spanish attack at the village location when he returned. Likewise, historians note Spain's priorities were largely Puerto Rico and the Caribbean Armada, not this remote outpost. Key points: Spanish theory. Spain had learned of Roanoke and briefly hunted for it, 1588. No evidence of a Spanish capture or massacre was found on Roanoke. White's own inspection found no telltale Spanish destruction. Likewise, historians regard a Spanish strike as unlikely. Gonzalez himself reported finding only a boat slip. Relocation and movement theories. Another class of theories posits that the colonists may have chosen to move, voluntarily or under duress, away from Roanoke Island, perhaps to reach a more sustainable location. Several variants exist. Chesapeake Bay, northward. Sir Walter Raleigh's original grant called for settling near the Chesapeake Bay. Some scholars, including David Quinn in the 1970s, argued the colonists may have traveled by sea or land to the Chesapeake, joining friendly Indians there. NPS notes Jamestown settlers later were told the Roanoke colonists fought and died in a battle around the Chesapeake before 1607. However, archaeological surveys in the Chesapeake have uncovered nothing attributable to the lost colony. The trip by open ocean or by arduous river route from Roanoke to Chesapeake would have been extremely difficult for non-navigators. Albemarle Sound, inland 50 miles. John White's 1587 map of Virginia has a faint mark about 50 miles inland from Roanoke, modern Bertie County, and White told colonists to relocate 50 miles inland if necessary. In the 2010s, archaeologists excavated inland, the Big Sandy site in Bertie County, and did find many English artifacts, 17th century window glass, kaolin pipes, etc. But these likely come from later colonial times. Critically, no fort or remains of a 1587 village have been found there. The Park Service cautions that finds could simply reflect trade. No graves or definitive lost colony structures have been identified. Thus, moving up the Albemarle Sound remains speculative. Hatteras or Croatan Island, southward. This overlaps the assimilation theory above. In relocation terms, it is that White's colonists went south and lived with the Croatans. The carved Croatan obviously supports this path. The NPS notes that Croatan Hatteras was a known site, and many Elizabethan period items have indeed been found there. White entrusted that information to future searchers. On the other hand, like Albemarle, no colony village or graves have been located on Hatteras Island either. Some artifacts, European brass, pottery, have turned up, but NPS points out they could have arrived through trade or were dropped by passing ships. The key fact, Croatan is the only direction indicated by the colonists themselves via White's clue.
Carolina interior, westward. Inspired by Strachey's Machump's story, a variant is that colonists walked or were carried west to tribes beyond the Tidewater, Tuscarora, Mandoeg, Cherokee. Horn's hypothesis is that they split among several Suon and Iroquoian tribes in inland NC. This meshes with Powhatan accounts that colonists were found with interior tribes, some enslaved. The Lumbee Indians of Insi, for example, have a long-standing folklore that they descend from these colonists, the Lost Colony theory of Lumbee origins. However, anthropologists like Swanton and modern genetic studies trace the Lumbee mostly to local Suon tribes. No archaeological site linking Roanoke to western Insi has been verified. Voyage to England, sea escape. A less discussed idea is that the colonists refitted the pinnace small boat White left behind and sailed back to England on their own. If true, the ship may have been lost at sea. A Wikipedia-sourced analysis suggests this is plausible, since a pinnace could make the Atlantic run, albeit precariously. No evidence, shipwreck, or survivors has emerged, but absence of evidence means it cannot be ruled out entirely. The sea passage would have been extremely dangerous, however. Other legends. In local folklore, a site called Beachland on Alligator River, south of Roanoke Island, gave rise to a tale that the colonists were on a secret sassafras harvesting mission. Engineer Philip McMullen and others in the 20th century argued Raleigh dispatched the colonists to gather sassafras, then a valuable medicinal good, and then abandoned them. This theory claims English records were falsified to hide this scheme. It is generally dismissed by scholars as a romantic conjecture and lacks direct evidence.
Key points. Relocation theories. Chesapeake, north. Jamestown colonists heard a battle story, but digs found no Roanoke traces. Open sea travel to Chesapeake seems beyond the planters' skills. Albemarle, inland. Archaeologists found colonial-era objects inland, but no village or tombs. The evidence is inconclusive and could reflect trade. Hatteras, south. White's carved clue points here, and many period artifacts are found on Hatteras. But again, no confirmed lost colony settlement. The assimilation angle covers this in detail. Western tribes. Powhatan reports suggest some survivors went inland, and later hostilities, 1607, may have been aimed at them. However, no specific location has been identified. Sea escape. A daring sea voyage is conceivable, but unverified. No remains or wreckage have been found. Fringe legends. The Sassafras expedition and similar conspiracies, secret mission, Walsingham betrayal, remain purely speculative with little hard evidence.
Environmental catastrophe, weather, and drought. Natural disasters have also been blamed. The Outer Banks are prone to hurricanes, and the 1580s saw unusual climate events. Hurricanes. A powerful hurricane in 1586 that struck Spanish fleet and another in 1588 did sweep the region. This led some to suggest the 1587 colony was wrecked by a storm. However, White's observations negate this on Roanoke Island. He explicitly noted there was no destruction indicative of a hurricane because the houses and fences weren't blown away, but merely removed. If a hurricane had struck after White left, we'd expect smashed palisades or debris, but he saw only neatly dismantled structures. In sum, there is no physical evidence that a storm destroyed the colony. The hurricane theory is generally considered unlikely given White's report. More compelling is climate data. A tree ring study, Stale et al. 1998, found that 1587–1589 were the driest years in 800 years in Virginia. This extreme drought could have devastated crops for both colonists and native neighbors, leading to famine. Indeed, Jamestown later endured starving times in severe drought years. Under such conditions, food shortages could force colonists to disperse to find sustenance. Nonetheless, drought alone doesn't explain the disappearance without trace. One would expect at least some skeletons or evidence of refugee camps if everyone had starved nearby. The NPS remarks that no mass graves were found that would suggest a catastrophic epidemic or famine on Roanoke. It's possible some colonists died quietly of hunger or disease,
but the complete vanishing act implies something beyond simple hunger. If the colonists had simply starved on sight, John White would likely have found bones or empty graves.
Disease. The hypothesis of an epidemic, smallpox, dysentery, etc., has been raised by analogy to Jamestown, but no contemporaneous record mentions an outbreak in Roanoke. Nor did White note any contagious disease signs when he returned. Mary Dare did die of sickness en route in 1587, but that was on the voyage to Roanoke, not in the colony. Some fictional accounts, for example the Darestone inscriptions, claim a pestilence struck the colonists, but these are now discredited fabrications. In absence of direct evidence, disease remains a possible contributing factor, but not a standalone explanation. Key points: environmental. Hurricanes. 2 major storms occurred regionally, but White reported no storm damage on Roanoke settlement. Buildings were intact and empty, inconsistent with a sudden tempest. Drought or famine. Scientific analyses confirm an extreme drought in 1587 to 89. This would stress any settlement. However, the lack of graves or remains argues against a complete wipeout by famine. Disease. No primary source records an epidemic at Roanoke. It's possible illness thinned the ranks, but again, no cemeteries or time bombs of bones have been found on site.
Internal conflict, conspiracy, and other ideas. Finally, some interpretations focus on human agency beyond environment or external attack. Internal strife or betrayal. Could the colonists have destroyed themselves? There is little direct evidence. The only hint of discord from 1587 was the colonists apparently losing faith in Governor White. He mentions they urged him to return to England, but no record of rebellion or execution is known. In the 19th and 20th centuries, fanciful theories flourished. In 1937, for example, someone carved the so-called Dare stones, mostly debunked hoaxes, that depicted internecine war and slaughter among the survivors. According to these inscriptions, now dismissed, the colonists fought among themselves and with natives, leading to only 7 survivors. Modern scholarship rejects the Dare stones. Encyclopedia states they have been determined a hoax, and treats their tale of war and murder as folklore rather than fact. Conspiracy, the Walsingham plot. A minority view by Lee Miller, 2001, suggested a sinister Elizabethan political plot. In her book, Roanoke, Solving the Mystery, Miller claimed Sir Francis Walsingham and jealous courtiers sabotaged Raleigh's colony to discredit him. She argued they withheld ships and supplies, stranding the colonists. Then when John White finally returned, officials preferred to claim the Indians killed the colonists, the lie of their murder, rather than admit the Crown's failure. Miller went so far as to assert many colonists were taken as slaves by native tribes to bolster southern plantations. This sensational theory is generally not accepted by mainstream historians, who note Miller's evidence as circumstantial. There is no primary document proof of any governmental plot or cover-up. Most academics regard Miller's account as an intriguing but unproven interpretation. Folklore and fictional accounts. Over time, many myths have sprung up. The play Eastward Ho! Of 1605 crudely joked that the colonists have, by that time, intermarried with Native Americans to make a whole country of English, which reflects both awe and discomfort with the idea of assimilation. John Bacon, in 1597, wrote that abandoning a colony was the guiltiness of blood of many persons. But of course, no one could definitively accuse Raleigh of foul play. No matter how vivid tales of witches, hidden settlements, or miraculous escapes, such as the CROATOAN tree legend of a witch named Cora on Hatteras, remain in the realm of local legend. They provide cultural color but have not yielded verifiable evidence. Key points: internal or other. Dare stones. Inscribed stones claimed to be messages from survivors.
were almost entirely discredited. The Encyclopedia summary flatly calls them a hoax. Conspiracy theories, including ideas of a deliberate betrayal, such as the Walsingham plot, or secret expeditions, are speculative and lack solid documentation. Scholars cite no contemporary records of foul play. Survivor sightings. Over the centuries, observers occasionally reported tribesmen with gray eyes or blonde hair on the Outer Banks, but such anecdotal evidence is unreliable and may be coincidence.
Archaeological insights and modern scholarship. 21st century archaeology has been at the forefront of testing these theories. Excavations on Roanoke Island, Site X at Fort Raleigh, by the First Colony Foundation have recovered 16th century European ceramics and trade items, but nothing conclusively unique to the Lost Colony. The assemblages are mixed with colonial layers from the 1580s. This means colonists lived on Roanoke Island as known, but the site was abandoned and no structure remained. On Hatteras Island, Mark Horton's multi-year digs, CROATOAN Archaeological Society, have dramatically expanded the artifact record. See rapier hilt image below. Together with Dawson's work, these suggest that CROATOANs in the 1600s possessed several pieces of English technology, guns, metal tools, and glass, that likely originated with the colonists. American heritage writer Edwin Grosvenor, 2020, emphasizes that until recently, the colony was never lost but abandoned at CROATOAN, a view reflecting new digs. He also notes the earlier accounts, Lawson and Ermstone, of mixed lineage. Other scholars caution that it could take decades to dig to find a definite settlement.
In Albemarle's Sound, digs have turned up colonial artifacts, gunflints, beads, dating 16th, 17th centuries, but all at a site later used by colonists and traders. No Roanoke-era village has emerged, and the finds may represent trade rather than actual Roanoke settlers settling there. Environmental research, tree rings, shows a historic drought, which modern historians often invoke to explain why colonists might have left their fort in search of food. Combined with the hammer scale iron slag discoveries on Hatteras, many archaeologists now see a plausible scenario. Some or all colonists moved to Hatteras, where they lived among the CROATOANs. As anthropologist Scott Dawson put it, they were never lost. It was made up. The mystery is over. Yet as archaeologist Nick Lucchetti retorts, we still haven't seen any evidence at CROATOAN of artifacts that indicate Englishmen were living there. The field remains divided.
In summary, what do we know versus what do we speculate? Documented facts. In 1590, John White found the fort empty except for carved clues. The structures were taken apart, not burned. No bodies or Spanish artifacts were found. Beyond CROATOAN, there were no clear instructions left. We have no primary account written by the colonists themselves explaining their fate, only what outsiders later said and what archaeologists dig up. Interpretations and theories. Every theory beyond the above rests on interpreting scant evidence. Assimilation with the CROATOANs is supported by the carved clue and many suggestive artifacts, White on native ancestry accounts, European trade goods found on Hatteras. Hostile attacks, either by Algonquians or others, are hinted at by later Powhatan reports, but lack on-site proof. Hurricanes and drought did occur and likely stressed the colony, but they alone cannot explain a clean disappearance. Relocation northward or inland is theoretically possible, but no archaeological site has confirmed it. Conspiracies, Walsingham, secret sassafras mission, and folklore, dare stones, witches' trees, etc., have garnered popular interest but little credible evidence.
Historians caution that many stories mix myth with fact. As colonial Williamsburg historian Paul Aaron notes, the Roanoke mystery has long been rebuilt from rumor and speculation. The Jamestown writers themselves reported conflicting tales. Modern scholars try to separate smoky evidences from cold data. For example, the coastal drought is a verifiable fact, whereas the notion of a Walsingham plot is not. Similarly, finding English objects on Hatteras, fact, does not prove the lost colonists lived there. Trade could account for some items, speculation. The important distinction is this: only the clues recorded by contemporaries, letters, maps, carvings, and the artifacts found on site are real evidence. Interpretations, who carved CROATOAN and why, where the colonists actually went, whether they died by war or weather, are educated guesses. The historical record, John White's reports, Strachey's accounts, maps, climate data, provides a framework, but within it, multiple narratives can be woven. In the end, no single theory commands unanimous assent. Each has pros and cons. Assimilation at CROATOAN is increasingly favored by new archaeology. A massacre scenario has dramatic appeal, but archaeologists find nothing on Roanoke Island to corroborate it. A move to the mainland or north was logistically possible, and even intended, Chesapeake, but again, no definitive site has been found. An environmental collapse could have forced abandonment, but would likely have left some trace of death or departure besides a carved message.
What can be said with confidence is what we do know. The lost colony left one recorded clue, CROATOAN, and every hypothesis beyond that remained in interpretation. As historian David Beers Quinn famously remarked, the scarcity of evidence has allowed all kinds of stories to take shape, none of which can yet be conclusively proven. The mystery endures, and each new archaeological dig or documentary discovery is weighed carefully against the facts. For a documentary script, we would emphasize this balance: the known, dates, carvings, accounts, in plain terms, and then label each theory as some scholars believe or one tradition holds, backed by citations of expert analysis. Ultimately, whether the truth lies under the sand of Hatteras, in a graveyard at Chowan, or at the bottom of the sea, the quest continues. As one modern historian put it, we can only say with certainty that the lost colony wasn't entirely lost to legend. After all, its disappearance remains one of America's most enduring puzzles.